Chapter 1. The Garden, Fête at Rosehill. The village of Rosehill lay like a little jewel set amongst the rolling hills of the English countryside. Neatly kept cottages with their rose bushes and hollyhocks faced onto winding lanes. Gardens were clipped, orderly, and seasonally bright. It was, to outward appearances, a place of peace. Yet, as Miss Jane Marple was often fond of remarking, wherever there is human nature, there you will find secrets, and sometimes rather nasty ones. It was the day of the annual garden fête, a red-letter event in the village calendar. Held upon the broad lawns of the vicarage, it gathered everyone of importance, or who thought themselves so, and many who merely sought tea, jam, or gossip. The June sun shone obligingly, dappling the tables under striped awnings, while bees hummed over the sweet pea borders. Miss Marple arrived just past 2 o'clock, walking slowly but firmly along the lane with her parasol neatly folded. She was greeted with warm smiles by those who knew her well, and with respectful nods by those who knew only of her. The quiet, elderly lady who somehow always seemed to understand people. On the lawn, the scene was animated. Stalls had been set up in the traditional fashion, jams and chutneys at one end, knitted shawls and embroidery at another, and a row of second-hand books and curiosities in between. Children dashed about with shrill laughter, clutching penny buns and paper flags, while the raffle drum sat proudly at the centre, waiting for Mrs. Bantry's inevitable announcements. The vicar's wife presided over the tea-urn, flushed but determined, while Dr. Travers had already settled himself with a slice of seed cake, gravely pronouncing it excellent for digestion. Miss Marple accepted a cup of tea, rather weak but very hot, and sat upon a folding chair from which she could observe. That was, after all, her quiet delight. Watching. She noticed Mrs. Pennington's sharp aside to her daughter-in-law about the uneven scones, Mr. Henry Carstone's lingering glance at young Mrs. Lyndhurst, and the exact, slightly superior tone with which Mrs. Bantry instructed a child in the proper way to fold a raffle ticket. All such things went into Miss Marple's mental storehouse, though to outward eyes she was but a gentle old lady enjoying her tea. The centre of attention, however, was a stall near the entrance, presided over by a tall, spare man with snowy hair and a dignified bearing. This was Mr. Archibald Blenkins. He retired after 50 years in service as butler at Marleycombe House, the ancestral seat of the Cholmondeley family. To many, Mr. Blenkins was a curiosity, a relic of an older age, with his impeccable manners and discreet silences. To others, he was a figure of fascination, for he was said to have seen things. A butler in a great house, after all, was privy to scenes and conversations that rarely saw the light of day. At the Rose and Crown Inn, over a single half-pint, he had occasionally let drop a phrase or a chuckle that suggested secrets untold. Never more than that, of course. A butler of his standing did not gossip openly, but the possibility lingered tantalizingly that Mr. Blenkins knew more of the Cholmondeley family's tangled affairs than anyone else alive. Today, he stood tall behind his stall of curiosities, brass candlesticks, an old carriage lantern, bundles of faded keys tied with ribbon, and even a silver snuff-box with the Cholmondeley crest faintly engraved. He greeted customers with a dignified bow, his voice deep but precise, his hands steady as they wrapped purchases in brown paper. Villagers pressed close, partly for the bargains and partly for the man himself. It was just past 3 o'clock when the incident occurred. Mrs. Bantry was bustling toward the raffle drum, her bosom heaving with excitement, and the vicar's wife was refilling the urn for the 3rd time. Children shrieked with delight at the coconut shy. Then from the corner near the gate there came a sudden commotion. Miss Marple looked up to see Mr. Blenkins sway. He had set down a glass paperweight upon the table, but his hand seemed to slip. It rolled off the stool and landed softly on the grass. His eyes widened, startled, and he clutched the edge of the table with a gasp. Several ladies exclaimed,
Someone cried, "He's fainting!"
But before anyone could reach him, Mr. Blenkins crumpled. His tall figure collapsed awkwardly, his head striking the edge of the table before he fell to the ground. The brass candlesticks rattled. A bundle of keys slid across the stall. For a moment there was stunned silence, then voices rose in alarm.
"Fetch the doctor! Quickly, the doctor!"
Dr. Travers was already pushing his way through the crowd, dropping his plate of seed cake upon the grass. He knelt, placed firm fingers against Mr. Blenkins's throat, then bent low to listen. His face, when he straightened, was grave. "I fear," he said heavily, "that Mr. Blenkins is quite beyond help." There was a collective gasp. Ladies pressed handkerchiefs to their mouths, and children stared wide-eyed. The fête, so lively a moment before, seemed suddenly hushed, the bright sun mocking in its cheer. "Heart failure, no doubt," murmured the vicar, though his voice lacked conviction. "Yes, yes, at his age," Mrs. Bantry said breathlessly, though she too looked shaken. Miss Marple, quietly setting aside her teacup, moved a little closer. She noted, with the unobtrusive eye that had long served her, two small details. First, the expression upon Mr. Blenkins's face, not merely slack in death, but pinched, almost surprised, as though struck by pain or shock. Second, a small paper cup that lay overturned beside the stall. A dark residue clung to its inside, and a faint, unusual odour rose from it, quite distinct from the usual tang of tea. The body was carried reverently into the vicarage drawing-room to await the coroner. The fête stumbled on in a subdued fashion. The raffle was drawn half-heartedly, the stalls abandoned early. By 6 o'clock the lawns were empty, save for trampled grass, and the faint flutter of bunting in the breeze. That evening the lanes of Rose Hill buzzed with rumour. At the Rose and Crown, voices overlapped in speculation. He was old, 75 if he was a day. Still, he looked hearty enough this morning. They say he muttered something just before he fell. Something about a confession. Nonsense. That'll be someone's invention. In her neat little cottage on the lane to Willowbrook, Miss Marple listened as Alice, her maid, breathlessly repeated the latest gossip while clearing away the supper tray. Miss Marple merely smiled, her needles clicking softly as she knitted. "Funny, though, isn't it, ma'am?" Alice said, lowering her voice as though the walls might hear. "I do say he had secrets. What if someone didn't want them told?" Miss Marple glanced at her knitting, then out of the window where the roses nodded in the twilight. "Human nature, Alice," she said gently, "is very much the same everywhere. A sudden death and people cannot resist a little embroidery. Still—" She paused, her voice soft but thoughtful. "Sometimes within the embroidery one finds a plain truth, waiting to be seen." Chapter 2. Whisperings in the village the morning after the fête dawned with deceptive brightness. Rose Hill, washed in soft sunlight, looked its usual peaceful self, but beneath the calm something had shifted. Neighbours greeted one another more gravely than before. Conversations broke off suddenly when a stranger passed. Every household, it seemed, had its own version of what had really happened to Mr. Blenkins at the post office. Mrs. Pritchard leaned across the counter to inform Mrs. Larkin that Blenkins had muttered the words, "confession,"
"truth," before collapsing.
By the time Mrs. Larkin repeated it at the baker's, it had grown into a firm report that the old butler had been about to expose some dreadful scandal. Mrs. Bantry, naturally, contradicted the tale with considerable authority, though she admitted there were plenty of things worth confessing at Marleycombe House. At her cottage, Miss Marple received Mrs. Bantry herself, flushed with excitement and brimful of rumours. She sat down heavily, hat askew, and fanned herself. "My dear Jane, such a to-do. One can't so much as step outside without someone demanding an opinion. Poor Blenkins, I always said he looked too thin for his height. Still, you'd think a man of his sort would last forever.
Such dignity.
But oh, this business of confessions, Nonsense, of course, yet one wonders. Miss Marple's needles clicked gently. People often embroider, my dear. It is human nature. But sometimes, within the embroidery, one may find a stitch of truth. By midday, Inspector Graves arrived from the county town. A careful man with a steady jaw and an unhurried manner, he wasted little time in establishing himself at the vicarage. With a sergeant in tow, he began taking statements from those who had been closest when Blenkins fell. Miss Marple, returning a shawl left behind, encountered the inspector just outside the drawing-room where the body had been laid. He touched his hat. "Good afternoon, madam." "Inspector Graves. You were present yesterday, I believe?" "Yes," Miss Marple replied, eyes mild. "I was sitting not far from Mr. Blenkins's stall." "Then perhaps you noticed something the others missed." "Folk often do without realizing," Miss Marple smiled faintly. "One notices what interests one, Inspector. I, for example, thought it curious that Mr. Blenkins's expression was one of surprise and pain, not merely the slackness of fainting, but shock. And then there was the little paper cup beside his stall. It had a residue, dark, with an odour quite distinct from tea. Graves's brows rose. "Indeed, the doctor believes natural causes unlikely. Poison is possible. Did you see anyone hand him a drink?"
"No," Miss Marple said.
But there were many comings and goings. It would not have been difficult. The inspector frowned. That is the trouble with fates. Too many hands, too many mouths, too many stories. By evening, the village had produced a suspect. Ned Booker, the handyman, had been seen speaking heatedly to Blenkins near the gate the previous day. Mrs. Price of the sweet shop insisted he'd shaken his fist. Rumour turned it swiftly into fact. Booker had quarrelled, and in revenge he had slipped something into a glass. Miss Marple heard this version from Alice, her maid, who repeated it wide-eyed. "They say Mr. Booker gave him cordial."
"Ma'am, and that's what did it." Miss Marple raised her brows,
her needles stilling. "Do they indeed?"
"That is very interesting. And yet, Alice, life is seldom so obliging."
When the truth appears too simple, one must always look closer. The next day, Inspector Graves questioned Ned Booker at length. Surly, defensive, the man admitted to a quarrel about unpaid wages at Marleycombe House, but denied harming Blenkins. "I've no call to poison the old fellow," he growled. "All I wanted was my due." To the inspector the case seemed convenient. Motive, opportunity, temperament. But Miss Marple, hearing of it later, shook her head gently. "Mr. Booker may be rough," she said, "but he is not subtle. Poison, Inspector, is not the weapon of the impulsive."
"It is the weapon of the calculating." Graves regarded her thoughtfully.
He had heard of her reputation. That evening, Miss Marple sat at her window, her knitting set aside, thinking quietly of Blenkins.
Loyal butler, keeper of secrets, suddenly struck down, perhaps silenced.
And she thought too of the faint, bitter odour in that cup, a scent she had come across once before in another long-past matter. "It will come to me," she murmured softly, "and when it does, perhaps the whole tapestry will be clearer." Outside, the village lay peaceful under the fading light, but beneath its calm surface, shadows lengthened. Chapter 3. The inspector arrives. Inspector Graves was not a man easily hurried. He moved with the deliberate care of one who knew that mistakes were made, most often, in haste. His square face, ruddy from years of outdoor work, rarely betrayed emotion, though his eyes, a steady grey, missed little. By the third day after Mr. Blenkins's collapse, Graves had made Rosehill his headquarters, lodging in the spare room at the vicarage and establishing himself firmly as the figure of authority. The villagers, while outwardly respectful, were secretly delighted. An official investigation lent drama to their gossip and a touch of the extraordinary to their otherwise quiet days. The inspector began with interviews, methodical and patient. He listened, took notes, and asked the same question twice in different words, a technique which often revealed more than direct accusation. The first suspect. His first serious interview was with Ned Booker. The handyman arrived at the vicarage in sullen defiance, cap in hand, boots muddy, his jaw set. "You've no call to keep badgering me," he muttered. "I told you plain. I spoke with the old man about what he owed me, and that's all." Inspector Graves regarded him evenly. "You admit, then, there was a quarrel?" A few sharp words, nothing more. He always was high and mighty, like he still thought himself at the big house. Booker's eyes darted about, avoiding the inspector's. "But I wouldn't harm him. Poison, that's women's work, that is." The inspector raised a brow.
"Poison, Mr. Booker?" "No one said anything about poison," Booker froze, then scowled.
"Well, that's what people are saying, isn't it? Whole village has got its nose in the air. Might as well hang me already." Graves made a careful note. Words spoken in anger, perhaps, but revealing nonetheless. He dismissed Booker with a warning to remain in the village. From her seat in the corner, ostensibly arranging flowers for the drawing-room, Miss Marple observed without comment. She noted, however, the way Booker's hands trembled slightly, not with guilt, she thought, but with fear of being wrongly accused, perhaps. The family connection later that day. Inspector Graves walked up the long drive to Marleycombe House. The great residence of the Chumley family loomed grey and dignified, its ivy-clad facade exuding history and wealth, though the upkeep had clearly slipped in recent years. Shutters needed paint, and weeds sprouted between the flagstones. Lady Caroline Chumley received him in the drawing-room, a tall, elegant woman with sharp features and eyes that assessed one like a falcon. She wore mourning black, though her relation to the deceased butler was purely professional. "It is most inconvenient, Inspector," she said crisply, "to have such a business connected with Marleycombe. Blenkins was a loyal servant, of course, and his death most distressing. But I trust you will make it clear this was an unfortunate natural event." "I shall make clear only what the evidence warrants, my lady," Graves replied with measured courtesy. "Did Mr. Blenkins ever speak of his health?" "Never. He was the very picture of vitality, stubbornly so, in fact. He refused retirement for years. When at last he stepped down, I thought it a relief. For him and for us."
"A butler of his generation can be
"Particular. Did he ever threaten to disclose private family matters?" the inspector asked bluntly. Lady Caroline's eyes flashed.
"Certainly not."
He was the soul of discretion. The very suggestion is an insult, yet as she spoke, her fingers twisted the pearls at her throat. A small gesture, but not lost on the inspector, nor on Miss Marple, who had accompanied him under the pretext of delivering embroidery for Lady Caroline's charity bazaar. Odd hints, that evening. In the snug of the Rose and Crown, the talk was all of Marleycombe. Villagers spoke of the Chumleys' dwindling fortune, of quarrels over inheritance, and of Mr. Blenkins's supposed knowledge of a dreadful secret. Each teller embellished the story, until by nightfall it included everything from hidden marriages to illegitimate children and missing wills. Miss Marple, sipping barley water in her corner, listened with quiet amusement. She knew too well how gossip worked. Like ivy, it clung to any surface and spread in every direction. Yet sometimes, just sometimes, a small truth hid at its root. The inspector joined her after making his rounds. "You've heard the rumours, no doubt," he said dryly. "I have indeed," Miss Marple replied, her needles clicking. "And one must always pay them some attention. Not for their accuracy, of course, but for what they reveal of human imagination. People embroider only on cloth they already recognize, Inspector. One asks oneself, why this particular pattern?" Graves gave her a thoughtful look. "You believe the butler knew something about the family?" "I believe," Miss Marple said softly, "that people seldom invent entirely from nothing. A little seed must exist, or the vine would never grow." A glimmer of truth. The next day, Dr. Travers called at Miss Marple's cottage. He was a man fond of medical detail, and his face was grave. "The coroner's report, Miss Marple," he said quietly. "It seems Blenkins did not die of natural causes. His heart stopped, yes, but under the influence of digitalis, in a dosage far too large to be accidental." Miss Marple's knitting stilled. "Digitalis?" she repeated. "How very curious. For that plant grows in many an English garden, does it not? Quite within reach of anyone with knowledge, or none at all." "Precisely," Travers agreed.
Anyone might have had access.
"But the manner of administration, in a drink, most likely, shows intent." Miss Marple's eyes grew thoughtful.
Then we must ask ourselves, Doctor, who placed the cup within his reach?
And perhaps more importantly, who benefited from his silence. A wrong turn, Inspector Graves, armed with this new evidence, moved swiftly. His sergeant reminded him of the paper cup Miss Marple had noticed at the fête. A discreet inquiry revealed that Ned Booker had purchased a cordial from the refreshment stall shortly before Blenkins collapsed. The case, to official eyes, seemed clear. A quarrel.
A motive, a poisoned drink.
The inspector, cautious though he was, felt the weight of expectation from both villagers and superiors. He prepared to bring Booker formally into custody. But Miss Marple, upon hearing the development, merely shook her head. "It does not fit," she said quietly to herself. "Poison requires patience, planning, and knowledge. Mr. Booker possesses none of these. He is rough, impulsive, the sort to strike with his fists, not with a teacup." She looked out of her window into the dusk where the first stars trembled. Somewhere among the calm hedgerows and tidy gardens of Rose Hill lay a mind capable of patience, of secrecy, and of the careful,
deadly art of poison, and she, Jane Marple,
meant to find it. Chapter 4. Inspector Graves delayed Ned Booker's arrest.
Uneasy despite the circumstantial evidence.
The villagers, however, had already decided. To them, the quarrelsome handyman was guilty, and conviction was only a matter of form. Yet whispers persisted that Mr. Blenkins's death was tied to Marleycombe House, and not all could be laid at Booker's door. The great house itself loomed over the village like a brooding sentinel. Miss Marple, walking along the lane with her basket, observed the ivy-draped walls and shuttered windows with thoughtful eyes. Once Marleycombe had been a place of splendour. Balls in the long gallery, carriages sweeping up the drive, ladies in silks descending the grand staircase. Now it bore the look of faded grandeur, a relic struggling to maintain its dignity. Lady Caroline received the inspector again, this time with an air of forced composure. Her nephew Henry hovered nearby, restless and uneasy, while Eleanor, his younger sister, sat quietly at the writing desk, her pale face betraying sleepless nights. "You pursue this business with unnecessary vigour."
"Inspector," Lady Caroline said, her tone clipped.
"Mr. Booker is known to be hot-tempered. You have your culprit. There is no need to harass this family further." Graves inclined his head. "With respect, my lady, the matter is not so simple. Mr. Blenkins's knowledge of Marleycombe affairs may be relevant." Henry shifted uneasily.
"This is absurd."
Blenkins was a servant, nothing more. If he chose to meddle in matters above his station, that is hardly our concern. Eleanor raised her eyes from the desk. "He was loyal," she said softly. "Loyal, Hemenkind. He never betrayed a confidence."
"If he seemed troubled, it was not out of malice." Her words hung in the air.
Lady Caroline's lips tightened. "That will do, Eleanor." Miss Marple, seated unobtrusively with her knitting, noticed the faint flush on Eleanor's cheeks and the way her hand trembled slightly as she set aside her pen. Such details, trivial to others, formed patterns in Miss Marple's mind. Later, in the village, gossip took new shape. Some claimed Blenkins had been about to reveal a secret marriage involving a Chumley ancestor. Others spoke of lost inheritance papers, conveniently vanished. The bundle of old keys from Blenkins's stall was mentioned too. Were they to forgotten cupboards at Marleycombe or to hidden compartments in the library? That evening, Inspector Graves and Miss Marple returned to the house with Lady Caroline's reluctant consent. The inspector examined the east wing, long closed to visitors. Dust lay thick upon the floor, but faint tracks suggested recent movement. A cupboard in the corner bore a lock that matched one of the keys from Blenkins's stall. Inside, they discovered a collection of ledgers, neatly bound and tied with string. Graves opened the first, frowning. "Estate accounts," he murmured. "Debts, mortgages, loans." "This house is drowning." Miss Marple read the neat, old-fashioned handwriting with quiet concentration. "And here," she pointed, "correspondence addressed to Lady Caroline. It seems Mr. Blenkins took the precaution of keeping duplicates." The inspector turned a page, his brow furrowing deeper. If these came to light, the family's position would be untenable. Bankruptcy, perhaps scandal. Miss Marple's needles clicked in the silence. Then perhaps, Inspector, Mr. Blenkins was not merely a servant with memories. He was a man who held the key to ruin and to protection. Such men rarely die of accident. As they left the east wing, Miss Marple glanced back into the shadows. It was not only dust and cobwebs that lingered there, but secrets long hidden. And perhaps the motive for murder. Chapter 5. The discovery of the ledgers caused a stir greater than any village gossip could contrive. Inspector Graves, careful though he was, could not hide the significance of what he had found. By the following morning, whispers ran like quicksilver through Rosehill. Marleycombe House was teetering on the edge of ruin. At the post office, Mrs. Pritchard declared that Lady Caroline had borrowed heavily from a London bank and that foreclosure was imminent. At the grocer's, Mr. Larkin announced with relish that the Cholmondeley jewels had been sold years ago. By tea-time, the tale had expanded to include a clandestine trip by Lady Caroline to a pawnbroker in Bath. None of it perhaps entirely true, yet none entirely impossible. Miss Marple listened without contradiction. She knew better than to fight gossip. Instead, she stored each embroidered detail away like threads for her own pattern. Inspector Graves, meanwhile, pressed Lady Caroline once more. She received him in the faded drawing-room, her lips tight. "Those papers were Blenkins's doing," she said coldly. "He kept copies of accounts without my permission."
"A breach of trust, Inspector. Nothing more. Nothing more?"
Graves's tone was mild, but his eyes sharp. "They reveal debts that cannot be easily met. Did Mr. Blenkins ever threaten to use them?" Lady Caroline's hand twitched against the arm of her chair. "Certainly not. He was loyal." "Yet he was selling oddments from Marleycombe at the Fête," Graves reminded her.
"Silver with your crest, old keys."
Why would a loyal servant disperse such things? For the first time, Lady Caroline faltered. Her gaze shifted to the window. He thought himself,
"Guardian of the house."
"He would not have harmed it," Miss Marple's quiet voice interjected. "Guardians sometimes act when others will not, Lady Caroline. And a man who knows too much may believe himself entitled to decide the fate of those secrets." The room fell into a chill silence. That afternoon, Eleanor Cholmondeley sought out Miss Marple at her cottage. The girl's face was pale, her eyes shadowed. "Please," she said, her voice trembling, "you must believe me. Mr. Blenkins was no enemy."
He was kind to me when others were not."
"He knew things, yes, but he would never have betrayed me." Miss Marple set aside her knitting. "My dear, no one doubts your sincerity, but kindness and discretion are not always the same. Sometimes, to protect, a man may act in ways that cause alarm." Eleanor clasped her hands. "He told me once that there were truths locked away in the East Wing. Truths that, if revealed, might destroy us."
"I thought he only meant old debts, but now—" "Oh, I cannot be sure. Did he name anyone?"
Miss Marple asked gently. Eleanor shook her head. "No, only that he feared shadows from the past." In the village, suspicions shifted again. Ned Booker, though still whispered about, was losing his place as chief villain. Now people muttered about the Cholmondeleys. At the Rose and Crown, a labourer declared that the gentry always hide something. Mrs. Bantry hinted darkly that families with old blood often had skeletons rattling in cupboards. Miss Marple, listening, saw the pattern, a murder that silenced a man with too much knowledge, debts that threatened ruin, and a family bound together by secrecy. Yet she also felt the presence of a hand cleverer than the village credited. Poison was no weapon of desperation. It was chosen with care. One evening, as the sun slipped low, Inspector Graves and Miss Marple walked again through Marleycomb's east wing. Dust motes floated in the golden light, and the silence was oppressive. "Strange," Graves muttered, examining the cupboard. No signs of forced entry, yet the ledgers were clearly disturbed. Did Blenkins intend to reveal them at the fete? Or was someone else already searching? Miss Marple touched the lock gently. "Sometimes, Inspector, a lock does not guard against intruders, but against discovery. A secret wished to be hidden, not stolen." As they turned to leave, Graves's lantern swept across the floorboards. There, in the dust, faint impressions of shoes could be seen. Smaller than a man's, lighter, but recent. "Not Booker," Graves murmured, "and not Blenkins either. These are a lady's," Miss Marple nodded slowly. "Then perhaps our tapestry gains a new thread."
One must ask which lady had cause to enter this wing, and what she sought. The following day, a new clue appeared.
Among Blenkins's effects, stored hastily at the vicarage, was a bundle of letters tied with ribbon. The handwriting on the outermost was delicate, unmistakably feminine. The letters were addressed not to Blenkins, but to Lady Caroline. Inspector Graves unfolded one. His brow darkened. "They are warnings, and from the bank, from creditors." He kept every scrap, Miss Marple read silently over his shoulder. Her sharp eyes noted one thing more. Among the papers was a letter in different ink, unsigned, warning of disgrace if the matter of Eleanor ever became public. The old lady's lips pressed together. She said nothing, but her needles clicked faster that evening as she considered what sort of matter, grave enough to disgrace, might be tied to the quiet girl at the writing desk. Rose Hill thrummed with talk of ruin, scandal, and hidden affairs. But Miss Marple's mind returned always to the fate, to the paper cup, the bitter scent, the suddenness of Blenkins's death. Poison was deliberate, precise. It bespoke calculation. Somewhere in Rose Hill or Marleycombe was a hand that understood patience, and had chosen the most discreet weapon of all. And Miss Marple, watching quietly from her window, knew that the key lay not only in what Blenkins had intended to reveal, but in what someone else had most desperately wished to conceal. Chapter 6. The days following the discovery of the ledgers were marked by unease, both in the village and within Marleycombe House itself. Rose Hill, usually so placid, seemed to thrum with watchfulness. Curtains twitched at every passer-by. Voices lowered when Inspector Graves crossed the green. Even the postmistress handled letters with an air of mystery.
As though each envelope might contain scandal, Miss Marple,
sitting at her garden table with her knitting, could feel it in the air, the subtle change when fear mingles with curiosity. Villagers were not merely gossiping now. They were guarding themselves, each one wondering how close the shadow might fall. Inspector Graves, though careful by nature, felt the pressure mounting. His superiors wished for a swift resolution, and the villagers clamoured for justice. He summoned Ned Booker again, questioning him for hours about the cordial and the quarrel.
Booker, red-faced and indignant, repeated his protestations. "I'm no scholar of poisons," he barked. "I'd sooner crack a man's skull than slip him herbs in his tea."
"I told him to pay me what he owed, and that was the end of it." Graves studied the man's roughened hands, the calluses, the blunt force in every gesture. Impulsive, yes. Capable of violence, undoubtedly. But of the patient, measured art of digitalis, the inspector's doubts grew. Meanwhile, an unsettling incident occurred at the vicarage. Mrs. Anstruther, the vicar's wife, discovered that a cupboard in the vestry had been rifled through in the night. Hymnals lay scattered, drawers half open, and a tin of petty cash overturned. Nothing of value was missing, save for a small, leather-bound diary belonging to Mr. Blenkins, kept there for safe-keeping after his death. The theft rattled the village. Why should anyone risk exposure for a servant's diary? What secrets might it have contained? Miss Marple, informed by the vicar's wife in hushed tones, listened gravely. "A diary," she murmured. "That is often more dangerous than a ledger. Numbers may threaten reputations, but words may reveal souls." At Marleycombe House, further tensions surfaced. Henry grew more irritable, pacing the halls like a caged animal. Eleanor withdrew even further, her eyes haunted. And Lady Caroline maintained a brittle dignity that convinced no one. Inspector Graves pressed them about the stolen diary. Lady Caroline dismissed it as a servant's idle scribblings. Henry sneered at the notion that Blenkins could write anything of consequence. But Eleanor's silence was telling. Her lips parted as though to speak, then closed again beneath her aunt's stern gaze. Miss Marple noted it all, the faint tremor of Eleanor's hands, the hesitation before each word. She saw in the girl a burden unspoken, and it weighed heavily on her mind. One evening, in the snug of the Rose and Crown, Miss Marple overheard a farmer declare that Blenkins had once been seen near the old summer house on the edge of the Marleycombe grounds, in whispered conference with a woman. "A servant,
"No doubt," said another. "Or a villager," muttered a third. But Miss Marple, listening carefully, filed it away.
Meetings in hidden corners often meant confidences, and confidences could mean leverage. The following day brought a darker development. Dr. Travers was called to the cottage of Mrs. Larkin, who had fallen suddenly ill after drinking from a cordial bottle purchased at the Fête. The symptoms were troublingly similar: faintness, palpitations, dizziness. Digitalis again, the doctor muttered, pale. Fortunately, the dose had been weaker, and Mrs. Larkin recovered after several anxious hours. But the implication was clear. Blenkins's death had not been an isolated act. Someone still held poison in their hand. Inspector Graves, grim-faced, convened a meeting in the vicarage. "This is no longer a matter of a single crime," he said. "The poison is in circulation. Until it is found and secured, no one is safe," the villagers murmured in fear, while Miss Marple sat very still. She knew that poisons did not float about on their own. They were kept, guarded, chosen. Whoever had supplied Blenkins's final drink still walked freely among them. And now they had struck again. That night, Miss Marple reflected on the widening pattern. First, a butler with secrets struck down, then a theft of his diary which might have held revelations. Now a second poisoning attempt, seemingly indiscriminate. The threads converged not on Booker nor on chance, but on someone with a clear purpose to silence, to conceal, to protect themselves at any cost. She thought of Eleanor's stricken face, Lady Caroline's twisting hands, Henry's restless temper, and she thought, too, of smaller details, a faint odour in a paper cup, the missing diary, the soft impression of a lady's shoe in the dust of the east wing. "Character?" Miss Marple murmured, gazing out into the moonlit garden.
"In the end, one must always return to character."
Actions follow nature's as surely as the seasons turn. Her knitting needles clicked, steady and relentless, as she waited for the next piece of the puzzle to fall into place. Chapter 7. The tension in Rose Hill grew as steadily as the summer heat. Doors were locked earlier, voices hushed more often, and even the children kept to their gardens rather than roaming the green. Poison was a quiet killer, and the knowledge that it lurked somewhere close cast a pall heavier than thunderclouds. Inspector Graves did not waste time. He sent constables to search Ned Booker's cottage, though the man swore himself innocent to the last breath. They found nothing. No powders, no bottles, no herbs tucked away in drawers.
Only muddy boots, blunt tools, and unpaid bills.
Graves was forced to admit, if only to himself, that the case against Booker was unravelling. Miss Marple, meanwhile, moved with her usual unobtrusive calm. She attended tea at the vicarage, dropped in on Mrs. Pritchard for stamps, and paused to admire Mrs. Bantry's roses, all the while listening, storing, and comparing. For Miss Marple knew that gossip was not idle chatter. It was a map of human behaviour, with its trails of envy, spite, pride, and fear. At Marleycombe House the air was heavier still. Henry paced the corridors like a restless hound, snapping at servants, while Eleanor withdrew almost entirely to her room. Lady Caroline kept her chin high, but her eyes betrayed sleepless nights. One evening, Inspector Graves confronted them in the drawing-room. The poison used on Blenkins, and later in Mrs. Larkin's cordial, was digitalis, he said firmly. Preparation not easily come by, unless one knows precisely what to look for. Digitalis grows abundantly in the grounds of Marleycombe, Henry sneered. So you accuse us of picking our own foxgloves like witches?
Nonsense. Not nonsense, sir, the inspector replied coolly.
The plant is common, yes, but to extract a lethal dose requires knowledge or guidance from one who possessed it. He let his eyes linger on Eleanor, who flinched. Lady Caroline rose sharply. Inspector, this line of questioning is intolerable. My family is not on trial. Direct your inquiries where they belong, among the villagers. They are the ones who gossip and pry, not we. But Miss Marple, seated quietly in a corner, observed the tremor in Lady Caroline's hand as it touched the mantelpiece, and she stored it away. The theft of Blenkins's diary still rankled. Graves questioned every servant, every villager who might have slipped into the vestry, but no trace of the book was found. Then, one morning, Mrs. Anstruther brought Miss Marple a small scrap of paper she had discovered beneath a hymn book. "It must have been torn from the diary," she whispered. The paper was stained, but the words were legible.
"You cannot remain silent.
If Lady Caroline refuses again, I shall speak openly.
Eleanor must be spared, whatever the cost." Miss Marple read it twice.
The words were those of a man torn between loyalty and conscience, willing to break silence for the sake of a young girl. It was not money alone that Blenkins guarded. It was Eleanor's future. The village seethed with theories. Some insisted Eleanor had been secretly married. Others claimed Henry had debts in London. Mrs. Bantry, with relish, repeated a story of a child fostered in secret. Miss Marple let the tales swirl, but she weighed them against human nature. Eleanor's timid glances, her fear beneath her aunt's shadow, spoke of someone bound by obligation, not scandal of her own making. Lady Caroline's iron control, Henry's bitterness. These, she thought, were the true levers. Then one night another shock struck. At the Rose and Crown, a decanter of port left unattended was discovered to contain a bitter sediment. Mr. Larkin, cautious after his wife's ordeal, noticed the taste and refused to drink. A test confirmed the presence of digitalis once more. The entire village was in uproar. This was no longer about silencing Blenkins. Someone was determined to sow fear. Inspector Graves tightened his patrols. "We deal not with impulse," he told Miss Marple grimly, "but with someone who calculates, who plans each step." Miss Marple nodded. "Yes, Inspector, and such a person cannot stop halfway. They must go on till their purpose is achieved." Alone that evening, Miss Marple reviewed the pattern. Blenkins had been silenced because he threatened to reveal something tied to Eleanor. The diary had been stolen to erase his written words. 2 more poisonings had followed, not fatal, but sufficient to spread panic. There was, she felt, a dual purpose: to protect a secret and to distract. The villagers were meant to look one way, while the truth lay quietly elsewhere. She thought of Lady Caroline, proud and unyielding, with her fingers always twisting at pearls. She thought of Henry, angry and reckless, but lacking subtlety. And she thought of Eleanor, pale and anxious, caught in a net not of her making. Character, Miss Marple murmured to herself. One must always look to character. Poison is not the weapon of rage, it is the weapon of fear. And fear, when concealed behind pride, can be deadly indeed. Her needles clicked softly in the lamplight, steady as her thoughts. The endgame, she knew, was drawing near. Chapter 8. The village awoke under a heavy cloud of suspicion. 3 poisonings, 1 fatal, and yet no arrest. Rose Hill, so proud of its tranquillity, had become a place where every cup of tea was eyed with doubt and every cordial bottle treated as a threat. At the vicarage, Inspector Graves spread his notes across the study table. "This is no random malice," he said grimly. "The pattern is too deliberate. Blenkins's death silenced him. The diary was stolen to erase his words. The later attempts are diversions, meant to confuse, to cast suspicion wide." Miss Marple, perched in a chair by the window with her knitting, glanced up mildly. "Diversions, yes, but not without purpose. Each thread leads us back to Marleycombe House." Graves frowned. "You suspect Lady Caroline?" Miss Marple's needles clicked. "I observe, Inspector, and I notice her pride, and pride that will endure anything save disgrace. Pride can drive a woman very far indeed." Meanwhile, Eleanor Chumley grew more distraught. She confided to Miss Marple during a quiet walk near the churchyard. "I cannot bear it any longer," she whispered. "Mr. Blenkins tried to protect me."
I think he meant to speak out, but he was stopped.
"My aunt insists silence is safety, but I feel it is a prison." Miss Marple laid a gentle hand on her arm. "My dear, silence can sometimes be the most dangerous thing of all, but truth, however painful, is rarely as deadly as secrets." Eleanor's eyes brimmed, but she said no more. That evening, Inspector Graves summoned Lady Caroline and Henry to the drawing-room. He read aloud the scrap from Blenkins's diary. "If Lady Caroline refuses again, I shall speak openly."
Eleanor must be spared, whatever the cost. The words hung in the air.
Lady Caroline's face stiffened.
Henry muttered a curse. What did Blenkins mean by this?
Graves demanded. Lady Caroline's chin lifted. "The ramblings of an old servant who meddled where he had no right." "Or the warning of a man who knew too much," Graves countered. Henry leapt to his feet.
"This is intolerable."
"Are we to be hounded for the ravings of a butler?" "Booker killed him, I tell you."
"Arrest him and end this charade."
But Graves was not convinced, nor was Miss Marple, who watched silently as Lady Caroline's hand trembled against her pearls. The following night, another incident drove the village to panic. At Mrs. Bantry's supper party, a jug of lemonade was found to have a bitter aftertaste. No one fell ill. The jug was hastily set aside, but the implication was clear. The poisoner was still at work, and bold enough to strike under many eyes. Miss Marple, who had attended the supper, noted the jug's placement. It had been set nearest to Eleanor. Later she sat awake by lamplight, knitting untouched. The poisoner grows reckless, she thought, or desperate. They strike not to kill at random now, but to ensure silence. Eleanor's silence. The next morning, Dr. Travers brought news. He had examined the scrapings from the jug. "Digitalis again," he said gravely, "but less carefully prepared, cruder, as though in haste." "Haste," Miss Marple echoed. "That is revealing. Whoever planned the first poisoning was deliberate, precise. Now they rush. And when people rush, Inspector, they betray themselves." Graves leaned forward. "You mean we are close?" Miss Marple's eyes twinkled faintly. "Oh yes, very close indeed. One must only arrange the right moment for the truth to show itself." Word of the latest attempt spread quickly, and the village buzzed with fear and speculation. Some declared Eleanor the true target. Others whispered, Henry wished her gone to secure inheritance. Lady Caroline was painted as both martyr and villain, depending on the speaker. Through it all, Miss Marple listened. For gossip, she knew, often revealed what people suspected deep down, and what they feared. She thought of Blenkins's last moments at the fête, his look of pain and surprise. She thought of the cup on the grass, the faint odour, the diary stolen, the letters hidden in the east wing. Each piece lay in her mind like a patch of fabric, and at last the pattern was nearly complete. That evening, Miss Marple sat quietly by her hearth.
Outside, the village lay hushed, but she felt the storm building.
The poisoner had tried thrice since Blenkins's death and would not stop. Fear and pride were powerful forces, but desperation was greater still. She folded her hands, eyes bright in the firelight.
Tomorrow, she whispered softly, we must draw the threads together.
The mask will slip, and then I think the truth will stand plain before us all. Chapter 9. The next day broke still and grey, as if the very sky held its breath. The people of Rosehill stirred uneasily, for they knew that Inspector Graves had summoned Lady Caroline, Henry, Eleanor, and several others to the vicarage drawing-room. The summons itself was enough to set tongues wagging. A reckoning, surely, was at hand. Miss Marple arrived a little early, slipping quietly into her accustomed corner. She carried her knitting bag, though she had no need of it. The needles were her disguise, the familiar rhythm that allowed her to watch without seeming to. Inspector Graves stood by the hearth, notes in hand, his manner grave. "We are gathered," he began, "because there have been repeated attempts at poisoning in this village.
One man is dead.
Others have been placed in danger. The culprit is among us." A murmur swept the room. Lady Caroline sat rigid, pearls twisting between her fingers. Henry scowled and muttered under his breath. Eleanor's face was pale as parchment. Graves went on. "The evidence at first pointed to Ned Booker, but the pattern does not fit. Poison is not the tool of sudden anger. It is the tool of secrecy and calculation. That tells us something of the mind behind these acts." Miss Marple cleared her throat gently.
Indeed, Inspector. If I may, it is not enough to look at opportunity, nor even at motive alone.
One must look to character. Mr. Booker, for example, is rough and quick-tempered.
His weapon would be his fists.
But poison, she shook her head. Poison requires patience and a fear of open conflict. Lady Caroline's eyes flickered, but she said nothing. Graves lifted the scrap of paper torn from Blenkins's diary and read it aloud. "If Lady Caroline refuses again, I shall speak openly."
Eleanor must be spared, whatever the cost. All eyes turned to Lady Caroline.
She rose with icy dignity. If Blenkins wrote those words, he exceeded his station. He meddled in matters that were none of his concern. Miss Marple's voice was soft, but it carried. But he was concerned, Lady Caroline, concerned for Eleanor. He feared for her future. And he knew that your silence, your determination to guard the Chumley name at all costs, placed her in peril. Eleanor gave a small, stifled cry. Henry cursed and strode to the window, refusing to meet anyone's eyes. Miss Marple went on. "Mr. Blenkins tried to warn you. When you refused, he resolved to speak. And so on the day of the fête, he was silenced, poisoned, not by a stranger nor by a quarrelling handyman, but by someone who feared what his words would unleash. Someone who prized pride above truth." The room was very still. Lady Caroline's hand dropped from her pearls. For a long moment she stood unmoving.
Then her shoulders sagged. "Yes," she said quietly. "It was I." A collective gasp rose.
Eleanor sobbed. Henry spun around, furious. Lady Caroline's voice remained steady, though her face was pale. Blenkins was loyal, but loyalty can turn dangerous.
He meant to reveal the truth that my niece's birth was
complicated, and that the estate already in ruin would face scandal.
I could not permit it.
Not for Eleanor's sake, nor for the Chumley name. He forced my hand. Miss Marple looked at her gravely. Pride is a fearful thing, Lady Caroline. It can clothe itself as protection, yet its true purpose is concealment. Blenkins wished to guard Eleanor. You wished to guard your name, and so you chose poison, a weapon discreet, but cruel. Inspector Graves stepped forward. Lady Caroline Chumley, I must place you under arrest for the murder of Archibald Blenkins and the attempted poisonings that followed. Lady Caroline inclined her head. Do as you must, Inspector.
I have done what I must. Eleanor wept openly, and Miss Marple went to her side, laying a gentle hand on her shoulder. There, my dear.
The truth at last is free, and though it brings pain, it also brings release. That evening, Rosehill buzzed with the news. The great lady of Marleycombe, a murderess. Some spoke with horror, others with glee. But Miss Marple, sitting quietly at her window, thought not of scandal but of human frailty. Love and fear, she murmured to herself. They are far more dangerous than hatred, for in the name of love and in fear of shame, people will do most dreadful things. Her needles clicked softly in the lamplight, steady as ever, as Rosehill's gossips swirled outside. The storm had broken, the truth was known. Yet the peace of the village, she knew, would never be quite the same again. Chapter 10. The vicarage drawing-room stood silent long after Lady Caroline's words faded. For a heartbeat no one moved. The ticking of the clock on the mantels seemed unnaturally loud, as though marking each second of disgrace. Inspector Graves, recovering first, signalled to his sergeant. See that Lady Caroline is kept under watch. She will remain here until I can escort her to the county jail. Lady Caroline did not resist. She sat as though carved from stone, her proud back unbowed. Only her eyes betrayed the strain, glittering too brightly, like glass under pressure. Henry stormed across the room, fists clenched.
You've ruined us, he shouted at her. Do you hear, Aunt? Ruined.
The Chumley name dragged through the mud. Lady Caroline's lips curved in a faint smile. Better ruin than scandal, Henry. Scandal would have destroyed us utterly. Henry swore and turned away, his face livid. Eleanor sat quietly, tears slipping down her cheeks. Miss Marple, beside her, gently pressed a handkerchief into her hand. The Search Inspector Graves ordered a search of Marleycombe House. Constables combed through cupboards and cellars. At last, in Lady Caroline's private writing desk, they found what Miss Marple had expected: small glass files, faintly stained, and a packet of dried foxglove leaves. Dr. Travers confirmed it.
Digitalis.
Crude but potent. Enough to dose a dozen men, the evidence was undeniable. Yet even then Lady Caroline maintained her composure. Yes, she said when confronted.
I kept them.
Blenkins would have spoken.
He forced me.
I could not permit it. Her voice never wavered. But Miss Marple thought she heard, beneath the steel, the faintest echo of despair, Eleanor's burden that night. Eleanor sought out Miss Marple in the quiet of the vicarage garden. The moon shone pale upon the flower beds, and moths hovered at the lavender. Miss Marple, she whispered, I must tell you, it is true what Blenkins meant to reveal.
My mother, when she was not married, I am
illegitimate. Her face burned with shame, but Miss Marple only shook her head gently. My dear child, that is no crime of yours. It is the crime of secrecy, not of birth, that has wrought such harm. Blenkins wished to protect you, not to expose you. He knew that truth born openly is less dangerous than lies smothered in silence. Eleanor sobbed softly, and Miss Marple drew her close. You are young, and life will offer you kindness yet. Do not let pride, your aunt's pride, dictate your future. Truth may sting, but it also sets one free. Village reactions. By morning, Rose Hill was ablaze with gossip. Mrs. Bantry declared it the greatest scandal in 50 years. Mrs. Pritchard claimed she had suspected all along. Ned Booker drank 3 pints in celebration of being cleared, loudly proclaiming his innocence to all who would listen. Yet beneath the chatter lay unease. If a lady of Marleycombe could commit murder, then no one was beyond suspicion. Respectability, once taken for granted, now seemed a fragile mask. Miss Marple, observing it all, reflected that gossip, though cruel, also served as a kind of justice. The village would remember Lady Caroline's pride and its cost for many years, and in that remembering, perhaps some lesson would be kept. The inspector's farewell. When at last Lady Caroline was escorted away, Inspector Graves lingered in Rose Hill.
Over tea at Miss Marple's cottage, he admitted his doubts. "It troubles me, Miss Marple."
She confessed readily, almost too readily. "And yet I cannot help but wonder. Had she not spoken, could we truly have proved her guilt?" The evidence was strong, yes, but not conclusive. Miss Marple poured tea with a steady hand. "Confessions, Inspector, are rarely simple. Sometimes they are made from guilt, sometimes from pride, sometimes from weariness. I believe Lady Caroline confessed because she could bear the weight of secrecy no longer. Her crime was committed in the name of pride, but her confession, I think, in the name of love, twisted though it was." Graves shook his head. "You see deeper than most, madam. I'll not forget your counsel. Loose threads. A week later, the missing diary was discovered.
A village boy poking about in the hedgerows found it half buried in the earth, its cover stained by rain.
Pages were missing, torn out in haste, but enough remained to confirm Blenkins's intention to appeal to Lady Caroline to acknowledge Eleanor's situation openly and to provide her with a portion of the estate untainted by secrecy. Miss Marple read the damaged book with quiet sorrow. For Blenkins, he gave his life for loyalty, yet in the end, loyalty became his undoing. She returned it to Inspector Graves, who placed it among the case papers. Resolution life in Rose Hill resumed, as life always does. The fate was spoken of with a shiver, the lawns of the vicarage never quite the same in memory. Marleycombe House stood grey and silent, its shutters closed, its future uncertain. Henry talked of selling. Eleanor, though saddened, felt oddly relieved. One evening, Miss Marple sat in her garden, roses blooming red around her, and spoke softly to herself. Murder is never born of hatred alone. It is more often born of fear, of love, of pride. Lady Caroline loved her family's name more than truth, feared disgrace more than justice, and so she chose poison. But the truth, once freed, has a way of enduring. The village will forget the details in time, but they will remember the lesson that pride may kill more surely than malice. Her needles clicked steadily. The sparrows chattered in the hedge. And Rose Hill, scarred yet enduring, folded the scandal into its tapestry of memory, as villages always do.